believe we were doing it even as we were throwing the soup.
We were put in a van, and that was the last time I felt freedom.
I had no idea that 2 years was on the cards.
If you do go to prison, is that something you can cope with? And he said yes.
It is horrendous being dehumanised in this place and just treated like a number.
In many ways, prison is harder on the people we love who are on the outside.
If she gets out, she needs to come back straight away or let go of what we have.
I do feel guilty because ultimately I have chosen this over her.
The single most effective way to change society is to engage in resistance, avoid going to prison.
The bigger crime would have been not to act.
We were walking through security to get into the gallery and then going into the gallery toilets to take off our jumpers under our coats so we could just unzip our coats and show our t-shirts.
It's October 2022. Anna Holland is in the National Gallery in central London, about to do something that will change their life forever.
I was very much on autopilot at that point, I think, just sort of going through the motions and just trying my hardest not to think about what we were going to do meant, trying not to think about, all the things that could possibly go wrong.
Anna had been a normal 20-year-old until the spring of that year. That's when they got involved in a newly formed and controversial activist group, Just Stop Oil. Anna had smuggled a tin of Heinz tomato soup past gallery security. They'd chosen Heinz for its vivid orange colour that would show up better in photographs. Together with their fellow Just Stop Oil activist Phoebe Plummer, they headed for the room that contained one of Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers. First, they had to get past a school group.
There's a group of primary school age kids all sat in front of the sunflowers, drawing their own versions of it, and we both just froze. And we both just instantly knew we couldn't do this in front of the children.
Buzzing with adrenaline, Anna and Phoebe tried their best to play it cool in front of the kids on their school trip.
We just sort of went to some of the paintings in the room and pretended to be looking at them as if we were normal tourists. I started talking about one of the paintings really loudly because I'd sort of forgotten how to behave like a normal person. Just really overcompensating for my anxiety. And then eventually the school children moved.
The next moments are a bit of a blur for Anna, but a video shows the two of them taking off their jackets, revealing their Just Stop Oil t-shirts, yanking off the ring pulls on their tins of soup, and hurling the bright orange contents against the glass covering the artwork. They knew how shocking the scene would look. The night before, they'd practiced getting the perfect splatter on a shower screen. In a video taken by another Just Stop Oil activist, you can see Anna and Phoebe calmly stepping over the barrier in front of the painting and crouching down on the floor as a man shouts, "Security?" kind of more a question than a statement.
Security!
With the soup dripping onto the floor, Anna and Phoebe each take out a tube of super glue from their pockets, coat their hands with it, and stick their hands to the gallery wall. Then Phoebe starts a speech.
What is worth more, art or life? Is it worth more than food? Worth more than justice? Are you more concerned about the protection of a painting or the protection of our planet and people?
As they make their speech, Phoebe's voice starts to wobble. By this point, a large crowd has gathered around them.
Fuel is unaffordable to millions of cold, hungry families. They can't even afford to heat a tin of soup.
All of a sudden, there were all these cameras in front of us, and Phoebe was talking, and then the security cleared out the room within 2 minutes, and then it was just me and Phoebe and all these priceless paintings.
Of course, the soup stunt pissed people off. Lots of people argued that vandalising beautiful art was hurting rather than helping Just Stop Oil's cause. Anna and Phoebe had known this would be the reaction. What Just Stop Oil wanted was media attention, good or bad. But what they hadn't realised was just how viral the action would go. The souping made headlines around the world. It was bigger than anything Just Stop Oil had done before, and it made the group a household name. Anna had expected to get arrested, maybe fined the cost of cleaning the painting's frame. They knew the painting itself would be fine because it was covered in protective glass. But what ended up happening shocked them and the entire climate movement. 2 years later, Anna was sentenced to 20 months in prison for damaging the frame of Van Gogh's sunflowers. Phoebe got 2 years. Like most of the people in this podcast, Anna spoke to us from prison. I'm Clare Hymer.
And I'm Rivkah Brown, and you're listening to episode 1 of Committed, a Novara media podcast about why some people are willing to go to prison for their politics. Over the next 4 episodes, we'll follow a group of Just Stop Oil activists who've been sent to prison. We want to find out what type of person forfeits their freedom for the climate crisis. Why do people like us who claim to care about the crisis not take the same risks? What's it like in prison, and is it any different for political prisoners? How does prison strain your relationships with those you love most? And after prisoners regain their freedom, was it all worth it?
We've also got more personal reasons for wanting to make this podcast. Rivkah and I are both reporters at Novara Media, and for the most part, we're pretty comfortable believing that our journalism is its own kind of political action. But what if it's not enough? In this episode, we meet 3 imprisoned Just Stop Oil activists and find out what made them so committed to sounding the alarm on the climate crisis that they took direct action and faced dire consequences. How did these perfectly nice, law-abiding young people become political prisoners, not to mention tabloid hate figures? And what's really the difference between them and us?
Okay, Claire, I've got a question for you. How have we got to the point where people like Anna are throwing soup at paintings for the climate crisis?
Well, because previous rounds of climate activism didn't work. Just Stop Oil was founded in 2022 because people felt that existing protest movements weren't doing enough to actually stop climate breakdown. There had been decades of peaceful protest, petitions, boycotts and lobbying from groups like Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace and the Green Party. And governments were still bulldozing emissions targets and licensing new oil and gas fields left, right and centre.
But Just Stop Oil weren't the first to be taking direct action on the climate crisis.
No, not at all. The UK has a really rich history of disruptive protest, including environmental protest. Greenpeace was scaling oil rigs in the North Sea, Friends of the Earth was holding sit-ins at nuclear power plants. In the 1990s, you had large numbers of people occupying fields to stop roads from being built over them, and that was actually relatively successful. Then there was this huge moment in 2019. That was the year Extinction Rebellion really got going, as well as the school strikes. Extinction Rebellion in particular was doing non-violent civil disobedience and pursuing tactics of mass arrests.
And yet, with all of this happening, little was actually changing in terms of government policy.
Yeah, exactly. So, building on the work of XR, in the early 2020s, Just Stop Oil co-founders Roger Hallam and Indigo Rumbelow set out to commit even more disruptive acts of civil resistance. That included everything from slow marching in the streets blocking traffic to vandalising and obstructing oil terminals. XR had largely taken actions designed to clog the courts for small offences. Just Stop Oil, on the other hand, knew that its activists could be getting into bigger trouble. After XR's explosion onto the scene in 2019, followed by the Black Lives Matter uprising and the Kill the Bill anti-policing movement, the Tories began introducing laws designed to make peaceful protest harder, like the new statutory offence of causing a public nuisance. The government also appointed an anti-protest czar, Lord Wolney, who recommended banning groups like Just Stop Oil in a similar way to terrorist groups. That recommendation wasn't taken up by the government, but ministers were still dead set on creating an intensely hostile environment for protest, including bringing in tougher laws with longer prison sentences. So while protesters had stepped up the disruption, they suddenly found that even minor acts of civil resistance, like sitting in the middle of a road, could land them in prison for months or even years.
In the past 2 years, Just Stop Oil activists, including both of the group's co-founders, have been handed record jail time. In July 2024, a judge jailed 5 JSO activists for 4 and 5-year prison terms after they were found guilty of conspiring to block traffic on the M25. At the same time, juries have acquitted activists, despite them admitting openly to having smashed up BP fuel pumps, glued themselves to a Turner painting, and invaded Twickenham rugby pitch during a final. Unsurprisingly, this has infuriated the government. In fact, the UK is getting a reputation internationally for its efforts in crushing protest. The UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders has called the government's crackdown on climate activists draconian. He added that before the government passed new laws like the Policing Act, it had been almost unheard of since the 1930s for members of the public to be imprisoned for peaceful protest in the UK. Pretty strong stuff.
The government's new laws hit Just Stop Oil hard. But even while many of its key activists were getting locked up, the group didn't retreat into less disruptive forms of direct action. Instead, it doubled down, knowing that its action would likely land activists in prison. But on the 27th of March of this year, after we'd recorded this podcast, Just Stop Oil made a shock announcement. The group said they were hanging up the high vis and ending their campaign of civil resistance. Meanwhile, several JSO activists are still due in court facing charges, and many will be in prison for years to come. In episode 4 of Committed, we'll talk to them about whether their strategy of risking prison was worth it.
Okay, Claire, I've got another question for you. We've worked together at Novara Media for quite a few years now. I know you are someone who cares a lot about the climate crisis. Not to put too fine a point on it, but why haven't you taken imprisonable climate action, Claire?
Yes, so this is a question I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And over the past decade or so, I've been in a number of situations where I could have got arrested on demos at protests. And there was even one point when some friends and I were speculating about whether we should do some kind of small-scale acts of climate sabotage. And that could have potentially landed us in jail. But for whatever reason, it didn't happen.
For what reason, though?
I think it was probably a combination of things. The first being that someone else did the thing that we've been talking about. And in a way, I guess that relieved us from this sense of responsibility for doing it. I think I've been telling myself that I also wasn't completely convinced of the strategy and therefore kind of allowed myself to be like, oh, well, you know, if I'm not sure that this is going to be a thing that's really going to help the situation, then I don't necessarily need to do it, which might have been a bit of a cop-out.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. It kind of reminds me of the story about someone being asked whether or not they were a revolutionary, and they sort of say, oh, I'll find out when the revolution comes, which is kind of a clever answer in some ways, but also, as you say, a bit of a cop-out. You just kind of find out when the revolution comes, but you're not going to be the one to make that revolution happen.
Exactly. As in, I think I was telling myself that I didn't believe in the strategy, and that's why I wasn't doing it. But then I also didn't find a strategy that I was happier with to pursue either. And then I guess on a really practical level, if I remember correctly, no one organised the second meeting. And why others didn't, I don't know. But it's possible that I just didn't because I was cowardly. This was a few years ago now. And I think these days I'm probably even less likely to even consider doing something like that. You know, now I'm in my early 30s. At that point, I was, you know, maybe mid-20s. And I'm now at a life stage where, you know, I want to build a life with my partner. I want to have kids soon and I want stability.
I think that's totally understandable. I mean, most Just Stop Oil activists are either young, like in their 20s or 30s, or older, like retirees. And I think that's because these are the groups that have the least to lose. They don't have high-flying careers or families to raise. I think there's also something in particular about our generation and the generation below us, so millennials and Gen Z, that are particularly inclined to get involved in activism because we're sort of disillusioned with the system's ability to work as it should for us anyway. You know, going to prison might make it harder for me to get a mortgage, but, you know, maybe I was never going to get a mortgage anyway.
Okay, well, what about you then, Rivkah? I know that you're someone who cares very passionately about lots of causes. And I imagine you're also the kind of person that might take a risk and do some direct action if you thought that there was going to be a payoff. Have you ever considered doing anything that could see you end up in jail?
I mean, I think for me, it's just that I could never imagine being in prison. Like, I don't think I have the kind of resilience that is required to be in prison, and we can find out a bit more about that later, I guess. But I think in particular, I'd struggle to be apart from my partner. I can't even imagine being in like a long distance relationship, let alone one where I'm in prison. I think I'm also just a very social person. Mostly you are just on your own and have to be really comfortable in your own company. I imagine that it's those kind of people that fare best in prison. On a selfish level, I guess there's also, like you said, worries about my future. Like, will I ever be able to buy a house? Will I be able to get a job? Will I be able to travel? Will I be able to go to America, for example? For me, the stakes of having a criminal conviction feel personally extremely high.
What's interesting, though, is that a lot of the prisoners that we've spoken to for this podcast, including Anna, do seem to have had the same anxieties at one point or another.
Couldn't believe we were doing it even as we were throwing the soup. There's still part of me that thought, no, this isn't us. We would never, not just break the law, but break social law like this.
Anna didn't see themselves as a potential criminal either. They just thought that they were doing the right thing. Which begs the question that really prompted us to want to make this podcast to begin with. How do you go from us to them? From a law-abiding goody two-shoes to, well, prison?
I think I know someone who can help us answer that question. His name's George.
I was like a little gamer kid. I was just like, what was I like? I don't know. I wasn't very like sporty or anything. Just like play video games a lot. Like I remember like some days when it was like really sunny outside, my sisters would be like, "Oh, George, come on, it's really nice outside." And I was like, "No, I want to play PS3 with my friends."
The teenage George Simonson spent most of his time gaming. Despite being raised by two environmental consultants, George was more interested in PlayStation than politics. But meanwhile, a new wave of the climate movement was kicking into gear in the UK. Other school kids were getting involved in the global movement of school strikes, led by the young Swedish firebrand Greta Thunberg.
When I first started hearing about like Insulate Britain and Extinction Rebellion, I never thought like, oh, I want to do that. It was just like a thing that was going on. Like I know people that were involved in like the Fridays for Future school strikes and stuff, but that was never close to me.
Yet just a few years later, a 24-year-old George Simonson found himself climbing a gantry on the M25, armed with a Just Stop Oil banner. A gantry, by the way, is a bridge over a motorway. How did George go from being this nerdy indoor kid uninterested in politics to an intrepid climate activist? Climate change wasn't a non-issue in the Simonson household. Like I said, George's parents were both environmental consultants. His mum even moved the family to a different house so that she could watch the swallows returning in the spring. She also made the family garden into a carbon sink, meaning she chose plants specifically for their ability to absorb as much carbon from the atmosphere as possible. But his parents definitely weren't activists. So here you have George, this kid from an eco-conscious, middle-class family who's not very political, but is very online. In fact, he's an avid user of Twitter. One morning in 2015, so George would have been about 14 at this point, he was scrolling through Twitter and reading about two men who'd stormed the offices of a magazine in Paris. He is, of course, watching the Charlie Hebdo shootings unfold in real time, and he feels sick. It's the first time George feels himself starting to care about politics. Because of the live feed presented to him by social media, he feels almost involved in it.
A year later in Cheshire, Anna, who was also 14, remembers another major political event being live-streamed via social media, the election of Donald Trump.
Now, these experiences are clearly quite different, but the fact that they both occur on social media, I think, is important. Whereas previous generations would have seen global events occurring from a distance, social media made them feel much more immediate. In this case, it gave both Anna and George the same sense that they had some stake in world events, that they were agents in them rather than simply spectators of them.
So both Anna and George have these moments of awakening, but they're both quite young, so perhaps don't feel so confident about engaging in political movements. The real political spark ignites for both of them in their later teens and early adulthood. For George, it was when Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, a murder that sparked the Black Lives Matter protests around the world.
There was a real cultural shift. It was obviously focused on institutional responsibility, but it was also focused on personal responsibility in terms of like being an effective anti-racist person and challenging existing cultural norms. That's one point where I do remember being like, oh, okay, I need to step up here.
At this point, though, the action George takes is pretty limited. He goes on a march, basically. But more importantly, the Black Lives Matter protests start a thought process. That process makes George realise that it isn't enough to have a carbon sink in your garden and call yourself an environmentalist, that he needs to do more.
When I started to like read a lot more into what was going on, I thought it was like a little bit hypocritical in that, like, you know, the easy and nice things were being done, like working on the garden and stuff, but the things that require sacrifice weren't being done in terms of eating meat and flying.
Even though, as George says, the real responsibility for the climate crisis lies at the feet of the fossil fuel industry and the government, George still has this sense that social change requires personal sacrifice, stepping outside of one's comfortable existence. It's a feeling similar to the one another Just Stop Oil prisoner called Rory Wilson, who was arrested for an action at Heathrow Airport in 2024, describes here.
Someone said to me, they used a phrase like, there's all these like liberal dickheads who do this and that and think it kind of absolves them of any real responsibility. At that point I was like, yeah, that is me. You know, I did do some things. I wasn't as culpable as other people. I did all my recycling, got all my clothes secondhand, but yeah, it definitely made me realise that I was definitely kind of complicit.
For Rory, it wasn't enough to go plastic free or even stop flying. He needed to do something drastic, or else he'd have to accept he was just another liberal dickhead.
So unlike George, Anna did get involved in the first wave of the school strikes in 2019. But then COVID hit and the strikes died. Anna's activism was briefly reignited the following year after the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Met police officer, which fueled the Kill the Bill anti-policing protests.
It was the first time I really came up against the police and saw them as something to be feared rather than something that should make you feel safer when you see them. And, you know, seeing the police, you know, seeing 8 or 10 police officers all, you know, chasing this one person and, you know, really like tearing them to the ground, that really shifted my motivation and it made me a lot more radical.
But like George with Black Lives Matter, Anna struggled to sustain their activism. That's not entirely their fault. Both the Black Lives Matter and Kill the Bill movements followed a similar trajectory. First, there was an initial explosion of energy that sort of petered out when the movements had nowhere to go. There just wasn't the sort of sustained, organised, anti-racist or anti-policing movements for Black Lives Matter or Kill the Bill to plug into, or any major political parties that were remotely interested in listening to them.
When Kill the Bill fizzled out, so did Anna's interest in politics.
I didn't really pay attention to the news anymore. I didn't really pay attention to politics. I just got a job working in a cafe. You know, I focused on my university work. And that lasted for about a year.
So Anna dropped out of activism, out of politics altogether. But then something happened that changed that.
One of my friends who knew about my past sort of bullied me into going along to a Just Stop Oil talk.
And this is really important. All the people we're talking to in this podcast didn't just find Just Stop Oil. Just Stop Oil found them.
So we're holding a talk on the university campus, and it really woke me up. It was like resurfacing after being underwater for so long. I'd forgotten what the sky looked like.
Anna went to a Just Stop Oil intro talk. First, they heard the brutal facts of the climate crisis. the science that shows that we're shooting way past emissions targets, the environmental breakdown becoming a reality around the world, the tipping points that we've already passed. Then they heard inspiring stories about the history of non-violent direct action and civil disobedience, the civil rights movement in the US, the suffragettes. They were told that taking political action isn't exceptional, but normal, and has been done throughout history. Then they heard testimonies from people who'd already taken action with Just Stop Oil, heard about the group's next action phase, and were told how they could get involved. What Anna heard was that action needed to be taken, that it could be taken, and that they personally could take it.
After the talk, I went up to Alex and I basically said, sign me up, I'll do whatever you need.
Anna wasn't just hooked on the message, but the messenger. Alex, the person who delivered the induction talk, soon became Anna's partner. There's a clear pipeline from Just Stop Oil intro talk to action. As well as non-violent direct action training, Just Stop Oil organises lots of socials for you to meet other activists in your area, people you will likely be taking action with. You're encouraged to go into great detail about your own motivations for taking action, your hopes and fears for the action, and for the future of the planet in general. You're encouraged to be vulnerable, which Anna says really helps build those bonds. Within a few weeks, Anna wasn't only involved in Just Stop Oil. Just Stop Oil was their life. They were training other activists, organising talks, and getting the movement ready for the next round of action. Their first arrest was just 2 months before the soup action, in August 2022, after they helped to block an oil terminal in Warwickshire. Anna didn't go to prison, although they did spend 30 hours in a police station, a huge amount of time for a first arrest. But somehow, the process didn't feel that traumatic. The main reason, they said, was the community they had around them. When they came out of the station, a crowd of their Just Stop Oil friends were there waiting for them.
You hear this a lot from Just Stop Oil activists. It's the community of other activists that gives them the resolve and the courage to take bigger and more intense direct action. Gradually, as you become more embedded in the Just Stop Oil community, you're buoyed up on the energy and commitment of other people, and also know that if anything happens to you, the community will have your back. I think community becomes particularly important in the case of 31-year-old Just Stop Oil activist Luke Elson. Luke's journey into activism was deeply bound up with his disillusionment with the world. As a kid in Leicester, the son of a hotel receptionist and a kitchen fitter, Luke dreamt of being an abstract painter. In his late 20s, he decided to leave Leicester and move to London to pursue his artistic career, but soon grew weary of big city life.
When I came to London, I think everything came too much. I think my lack of hope and just my fear for my niece's future, and I don't personally feel comfortable in the world that I live in. I just think so much effort and time and resources goes into things that do more damage than good. And I felt that for a long time. And shortly after being in London, I became really depressed. And I think I was suicidal for 6 months. But then I got help and therapy, and that really helped. And then I started coming out of it.
Luke was just starting his recovery when he was handed a leaflet by someone in Brixton. It was Just Stop Oil. Like Anna, Luke went to an intro talk, which made him feel like he didn't need to just be a victim of capitalism, but could fight against it. The people he met at the talk also really moved him and restored some of the faith in humanity that he'd lost coming to London.
From then onwards, I just continued to volunteer at JSO and meet more of the community and engage. And I've met some of the best people I've met in my life has been from JSO. People who are just so selfless and giving and caring and determined to do everything they can to hold our government accountable.
But at this point, he was still depressed. You might think that there's something a bit coercive about the charismatic community of Just Stop Oil that means vulnerable people like Luke end up doing things they don't fully understand the consequences of. In reality, that's not really the case. None of the activists we've spoken to for this podcast felt like they were coerced into taking action with Just Stop Oil. In fact, they often point out that the group works really hard to identify people who might be volunteering for things that they're not prepared for. If you went to an intro talk last week and this week you're trying to climb a gantry, or you're someone who's openly talked about having mental health issues in the recent past and now putting yourself up for potential prison time, someone is almost definitely going to step in.
So tell us a bit more about Luke's family. Were they involved in politics or anything?
Not from what he told me. The only political leanings that Luke knew of among his family members was that his granddad had been a Tory voter, because as a farmhand, his grandpa felt that if his boss thrived, so would he. As for activism, Luke was always terrified of the idea of going to prison.
The idea of someone taking away my freedom, my liberty, and not being able to do what I wanted absolutely terrified me. Because, personally, the most valuable thing to me, apart from my loved ones, is my time, because that's something you can't buy, something you can't get back. Once you lose it, you lose it.
Obviously, the main thing that changed that fear for Luke was coming across Just Stop Oil in 2022. But another thing that maybe started off that process of Luke being more open to radical climate activism actually happened a couple of years before that, in 2020, when his niece Frankie was born.
I held her and I just burst into tears. Felt this level of love that I've never felt before. And then something just clicked and I was no longer thinking about my future, I was thinking about her future. And I just kept thinking to myself that this world isn't good enough for her. It's not good enough for her. It's dangerous. There's so much uncertainty. It's not fair.
The birth of baby Frankie, and later his second niece Bonnie, had a paradoxical effect on Luke. On the one hand, Luke says it worsened his depression. When he thought about his niece's future, the dangers and disappointments of the world appeared to him in technicolor. On the other hand, the birth of his nieces energized Luke. He didn't feel like his own future was worth fighting for, but his two tiny nieces? Luke's mind became totally focused on what he needed to do to ensure they had a planet worth living on.
For Anna, the journey to taking the action that landed them in prison was a bit different. Ever since they were a child, they'd admired those who have made huge sacrifices for important causes. It began with storybooks, stories about people living through revolutions.
One of my favourite books when I was younger was The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, which is set during, it's set in a fictional version of Chile, but set during a civil war. And one of the main characters was one of the freedom fighters. It felt so heroic to dedicate your life to a cause that was so much greater than yourself.
We know already that before getting involved with Just Stop Oil, Anna had become frustrated with the tamer forms of action that they'd been involved with. They'd been organising marches, signing petitions, writing endless letters to their Member of Parliament, and not really getting anywhere with it. So they decided to join Just Stop Oil, partly because they thought it would be more politically effective, but also because they wanted to be a revolutionary, not a petition writer.
Ever since I'd read those stories about people getting arrested for what they believed in and coming out stronger in spirit, if not in body, I knew I wanted to be one of those people.
Before we go on, I wanted to thank Novara Media's listeners, especially our monthly supporters, for making this podcast possible. Our team has spent over 300 hours making Committed, from doing interviews to designing artwork to editing hundreds of hours of tape into something we think will inform, provoke, and maybe even change you. Novara Media wants to keep telling the stories the mainstream media won't about the people shaping our politics. And we can't do it without you. So thank you.
Anna certainly got their big hero moment. The cameras flashing as they sat beneath one of the most famous paintings in the world, now covered in orange soup. But like so many wannabe revolutionaries, Anna paid the price for their rebellion, partly in prison time and partly in becoming a national hate figure. By the following year, Just Stop Oil had become one of the most hated groups in Britain.
According to a YouGov poll from July 2023, 64% of people have a negative opinion of the group, and only 17% have a positive one. Just Stop Oil activists often get verbally and sometimes even physically abused during actions. In May 2023, a car drove through a group of Just Stop Oil activists, allegedly running over a woman's foot. 2 months later, a driver got out of his car and punched to the ground and kicked a Just Stop Oil activist who was slow marching on the road. How does it feel to have so much of the country's ire directed at you? George Simonson told us he actually understands why people feel how they do.
It's valid for them to be really pissed off at me, because I know that what I'm doing in the past has pissed people off, ruined people's days, that kind of thing. Yes, I'm doing something that has annoyed people, but it's for the sake of preventing a far worse outcome for them and everyone else.
And though a lot of people get pissed off by the disruption that Just Stop Oil causes, other people are positively triggered by it. Rory Wilson joined the climate movement after being on a DLR train that had been stopped by Extinction Rebellion.
Anna's face was all over the news in the hours after the Van Gogh souping. But many other Just Stop Oil activists didn't get the glory of going viral after their protests.
The arrests of Just Stop Oil activists are almost always quite anticlimactic. In fact, they're often full of false starts and near misses. The night before he climbed a gantry on the M25, George Simonson was practicing using his equipment, including a D-lock he planned to use to lock his neck to the gantry. The kind of lock he'd used many times on his bike before, and a pretty straightforward bit of kit, you'd think.
I just wasn't thinking at all, and so I just put the D-lock around my neck and fully attached it, and then swiveled the code around. I came back to myself right afterwards, and I was like, oh my god, what have I done? So I was just panicking and thinking, am I going to go to a hospital to try and get this cut off me, or am I just going to go to sleep and then climb up the gantry in the morning with this still around my neck? After a couple of minutes, I managed to get it off, but I was so relieved, but I was also oh my god, I'm such a fucking idiot.
There was further slapstick in store for George. One of the aims of the gantry action had been to communicate a message to drivers going past. All of the gantry climbers were therefore equipped with massive banners that they were to unfurl once they'd made their ascent. But when George finished climbing his gantry, the police had already begun arriving. To make matters worse, the banner he'd been given was, according to him, ginormous, much bigger than the ones other Just Stop Oil activists had been given. George estimated that he wouldn't have a huge amount of time before the police came up and got him, so he didn't bother unfurling his banner.
Luke's arrest was also a massive anticlimax. He was among a group of Just Stop Oil activists arrested at Heathrow Airport in July 2024. Luke was brought in by the police even though he hadn't taken any disruptive action. All he and the others actually did that day was cycle up to the airport's perimeter fence.
It was quite nice, because it was a lovely day, and I was cycling, and obviously living in London, I missed being out in the sticks. So there was a lot of trees and fields and stuff. It just felt like a nice cycle, and then we stopped and had my last cigarette, and then a quick toilet break. And then that's when it kind of felt a bit more serious, because we were getting close to the airport. At that point, there'd been a van that had passed us twice, and I'd noticed the person in the van looking at us twice. So that's when I started getting a bit suspicious.
Luke realised that the police were catching up with the group, and it was probably curtains.
And we went to traffic lights, and it was a red light, so we were waiting. And I saw blue lights in the corner of my eye, coming from behind us, and then I just instantly knew, I was like, these guys are for us, 100%. And then they drove past us, and then pulled up in front of us, and then parked right in front of us, and then got out.
The action was over before it had begun. 2 police officers emerged from their car and calmly approached Luke on his bike.
And then I had one officer to my right who had a hand on my right arm, and I had another officer who had their hand on the bike. And they asked very nicely if I could get off the bike and step to the side, and I was like, yeah, no problem. And I just reminded them that I'm non-violent, I'm not going to cause them any harm. And then we were taken to the side and spoken to, and we were searched, and then 40 minutes later, we were put in a van, and that was the last time I felt freedom.
And just like that, Luke Elson's life as he knew it was over. This young man who'd been pouring his life into activism would be forced into a life of inactivity, spending 22.5 hours of his day in a cell. Luke was instantly put on remand and sent to HMP Wandsworth and then Wormwood Scrubs, the notorious Victorian prison in West London.
After the soup-throwing action, Anna Holland was sentenced to 20 months, first served at HMP Bronzefield and then at HMP Send, 2 women's prisons in Surrey.
George Simonson was sentenced to 2 years in prison for the M25 Gantries action and was sent to HMP The Mount, a men's prison in Hertfordshire.
While Rory pleaded guilty to the action at Heathrow Airport, Luke pleaded not guilty. At the time we're recording this podcast, Luke's trial is ongoing. We'll find out what happened to him and the rest of the Heathrow 10 in future episodes.
In the second episode of Committed, we'll follow our activists into prison to find out what life's actually like on the inside. Everything from the food they eat to the visits they're allowed, the unexpected interactions activists have with other prisoners and with guards, and the unique ways they adapt. We'll ask ourselves whether we could hack what the Just Stop Oil prisoners are going through, and discover that our answers change the more we find out.
This call is from a person currently in a prison in England. All calls are logged and recorded and may be listened to by a member of prison staff. If you do not wish to accept this call, please hang up now.
Hello?
Committed is a podcast from Novara Media. It was reported and presented by Rivkah Brown and Clare Hymer. The producers were Richard Hames and Chal Ravens. Music and sound editing was by Matt Huxley. Art direction was by Pietro Garone and Filippo Mara. Thanks to all of the prisoners, their partners, friends and family members who spoke to us for this podcast. Thanks also to their prison buddies, Alex, Jamie, Kate and Pia. And thanks to Bertie Coyle from Just Stop Oil.
Hey, Rivkah here. Thank you to every single person who supports Novara Media with a monthly donation. You made this show and all of our journalism. Novara Media is on a mission to tell stories the rest of the media won't touch, and having no billionaire donors or advertisers means we can do just that. So if you're enjoying Committed and want us to do more original, fearless journalism, go to novaramedia.com/support and give 1 hour's wage a month or whatever you can afford.